The concept of equality is controversial because there are so many different definitions for equality. In its most basic form, equality means that people who are in the same situation should be treated the same. The dominant view of equality in South Africa has become, however, inseparably linked to the notion of representativity. In a South African context, this means that the national demographics of the country must be represented in every sphere of society, including the different sectors of the economy and the different levels of employment. This notion of equality found its way into various laws that regulate various spheres of society, but in particular, the labour market. Affirmative action was introduced by the Employment Equity Act of 1998, which states that equitable representation must be achieved in all occupational levels in the workplace. The designated group that should receive preferential treatment according to the Act is defined as black people, women, and people with disabilities. Black people is defined as a generic term which means Africans, Coloureds, and Indians. Practically speaking, the designated group earmarked for preferential treatment includes virtually everyone except white men without disabilities. The Act compels employers to take steps to promote equal opportunities in the workplace by eliminating unfair discrimination. The Act further states, however, that it is not unfair to discriminate against people when affirmative action measures are taken consistent with the purpose of the Act. Every employer is compelled by the Act to implement affirmative action measures to promote the interests of the designated groups. The broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act of 2003 was adopted with the aim of developing a legislative framework within which black economic empowerment must take place. Black people are again defined in the Act. There is, however, no definition for white people in the South African legal system, particularly since the Populations Registration Act of 1950 was repealed due to the fact that it was generally regarded as racist. Black empowerment is defined by the BEE Commission as follows. It is an integrated and coherent socio-economic process. It is located within the context of the country's National Transformation Programme, namely the RDP. It is aimed at redressing the imbalances of the past by seeking to substantially and equitably transfer and confer the ownership, management and control of South Africa's financial and economic resources to the majority of its citizens. It seeks to ensure broader and meaningful participation in the economy by black people to achieve sustainable development and prosperity. The Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act of 2000, better known as the Equality Act, declares that constitutional democracy cannot realize in South Africa as long as social and economic inequality are not eradicated. While the Equality Act prohibits unfair discrimination, it also states that it is not unfair discrimination to take measures designed to protect or advance persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination or members of such groups or categories of person. The use of the term categories of persons is significant because it implies that it is not necessary to prove that an individual has been disadvantaged by unfair discrimination, but merely that the person has to be part of the right category. Personal circumstances of the individual, such as socio-economic circumstances, are thus irrelevant. It is thus clear that the overarching goal of affirmative action in South Africa is merely to categorize people to skin color and to provide preferential treatment to categories of persons, regardless of their socio-economic circumstances. Consequently, race-based quotas are found in a myriad of facets of South African society, from university enrollment to job appointments and sports teams. Prescribed racial quotas in sports is another example of discrimination against minorities in South Africa. Explicit racial quotas are used under the guise of transformation to deprive minorities of fair and equal opportunities to represent their respective provinces and country. The ANC's 50th National Conference decided that government should put legislation in place which would allow the Minister of Sport to intervene proactively in sport to serve as a vehicle for achieving national goals. As a result, sport in the national context was no longer perceived as a tool to build a non-racial democratic sport industry, but rather as a vehicle to achieve social transformation. Markedly, an acceleration in the interventionist attitude of the governing ANC was noted at the 51st National Conference. Resolutions called for government to play a central and, where necessary, interventionist role in the transformation of sports and recreation, among other. The South African government proposed legislation in 2019 that calls for even more power to be given to the government to increase government's role in all spheres of South African sport. The clear political interference in sport in South Africa can be further demonstrated with numerous examples. In 2019, the Gauteng province netball trials became mired in controversy after evidence was revealed that several white players between the ages of 12 and 18 were not selected simply because of their skin color. In 2019, white athletes as young as 9 years old who qualified to represent their provinces at the national championships were almost left at home because South African schools athletics had declared that only one white child per item would be allowed to represent their province at the championship. This decision was later changed. First-year students at most of South African universities are registered on a racial quota basis. In many cases, there are different admission requirements for different races. The South African Police Service operates on a quota system policy for hiring and promotion. Positions are left vacant if the candidate of the appropriate race cannot be recruited, even if another qualified person of a different race is available. In 2016, the Labour Court found that the SAPS's previous employment equity plan of 2010 to 2014 was unlawful and invalid as it imposed racial quotas. Companies are scored based on the quota of black ownership, black senior managers, black training, as well as black suppliers. These scores then translate to their ability to compete for government tenders. However, rather than righting the economic wrongs of the past, BEE was used as a vehicle for corruption and cadre deployment. It only serves a small, connected elite rather than the impoverished, often at the expense of the latter. It is considered taboo or politically incorrect in the current South African political climate to question aspects of transformation, black empowerment or racial quotas. Any attempts to assess the mode of transformation or aspects thereof are met with hostile reaction from the government. The former chairperson of the National Assembly's Portfolio Committee on Sport and Recreation, Butana Kompela, said that the Constitution requires transformation and that doing away with this policy would amount to treason. Racial transformation and quota systems enforced on various spheres of society are used interchangeably, and it is often asserted that quotas are legitimate even though the South African Constitution makes no mention of either transformation or quotas. The ANC's definition of transformation displays ignorance and a lack of understanding of the issue. For example, former Director General of the Policy Coordination and Advisory Services in the Presidency, Joel Netsitenzi, wrote that transformation entails that all levers of power, in other words, state institutions, must be brought under the control of the National Liberation Movement, in other words, the ruling party, and that they should reflect in their composition the demographics of the country, and they should owe allegiance to the new order. In other words, the transformation defined by the ANC does not focus on building unity or improving society's ills, but entails the social re-engineering of society and is accompanied by a hegemony over institutions through cadre deployment. My name is Ernst and this is your fact sheet.